Right, I'm Kingsley. I'm going to talk to you tonight a bit about blockchain, what it is, why you might be interested in it, why you might want to use it, why it might set the earth on fire and boil the ocean. So, actually it's not all that severe. So, alright, so let's get started. So, what the block? So, a bit about me, that's the Crypto Kitty me. Some background here, so my main job is really looking after 3 kids. I also have a coffee shop over by West Worthing Station. Sorry, this is the couple of minutes filler where I get to shill all of my stuff before we get into actual blockchain content. So I've got a coffee shop over by West Worthing Station. It's beautiful and brilliant and ethical as well. I also run a conference every November in Brighton called Good Tech Conference, which is about tech ethics and trying to do the right thing in tech. Breakpoint Radio is a podcast that I used to run for a good couple of years, and it's very ad hoc, but that's really, I guess, what got me started down the road of looking at blockchain. It's a future tech podcast, and we probably started looking at blockchain stuff there about 3 or 4 years ago, I'd say. So probably around the time of DevCon 1, the first Ethereum conference, which is in London, if anyone remembers that or went to it. Otherwise, for the main day job, I'm a partner in a Scala consulting company called _Consulting, who do FP and all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. So that's me. Get a quick gauge of what people know in the room about blockchain and crypto and one thing and another too. So, who here works in tech? I'm guessing everyone? Yeah? Okay, that's pretty much everyone who can put their hands up. Who has Bitcoin or has had Bitcoin? Has mined Bitcoin? Mined it too? Wow, okay. Awesome. Still got Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. Hence why you're here and not on a jet. So, okay. Works in crypto? Yep, so that counts too, and yes, yeah, of course. And finally, who has a bank account? Okay, not everyone does, which is a potential case for blockchain later on, but okay. So everyone has bank accounts, so something like this probably looks quite familiar to most people. Possibly not the bottom line, which is 8.5 grand or whatever credit, but I imagine the idea of a bank statement is reasonably familiar to people. Yeah? And so generally people put their money with an institution, that institution marks all of their credits and debits, and if you want to find out your position on your bank account, you basically tot up your credits and debits, and the final position is the balance of your account. So centrally held ledger of your credits and debits, and there's not a point at which values are changed as you go through this. It's just an append-only record of what's in your bank account. So you can also see things like if a fraudulent transaction's happened, you'll often see something like X has happened and then has been reverted afterwards by a credit that matches that debit. So the point kind of being made is that the general ledger is something that grows and grows and is added to, and to get an idea of your position on that general ledger, things aren't mutated, things aren't changed in the past, the history is not rewritten, it's just changed so that your final current position is the additive the accumulation of all the transactions that have happened to that point in time. So, and generally, the idea of the general ledger of transactions going in and out, the credits and debits, is pretty much how the banking system works. So your account statement here is very similar, if not identical, maybe not the balance at the end, to an account statement from another bank in another country, the idea of this general purpose ledger. So works really well, and people invest a lot of time, energy, support, and trust into a central banking system. However, things changed. So 2008 was the general financial crisis, the global financial crisis. Who remembers the global financial crisis when it struck? Yeah, and you probably remember things on the news too of people carrying beautiful chairs and signs out of Lehman Brothers offices, and people rioting, panic on the streets of London and all the rest of it. Also probably remember boards going up at Northern Rock Bank, Northern Rock Bank then being taken back into kind of institutional care or remedial help, and then separated and sold off. So around 2007, 2008, people started to have slightly less trust in the global banking system, slightly less trust there. So we can see lots of things around stocks and prices falling in the banking system, and this pretty much caused a bit of a wobble, a ripple effect across financial institutions, and a sudden lack of trust in a party who had been trusted up to that point in time. So a great point in time, or a great bit of context to say maybe an alternative was on the horizon, or people were more receptive to an alternative than putting all of their trust and all of their funds in a central and global banking institution. So around this point in time is when maybe people are looking for a hero. So Bitman lives. So around 2008 was also the white paper and the reference implementation of Bitcoin. So Bitcoin being not necessarily direct replacement for the global banking system, but a general purpose, general ledger, and a way in which trust could be vested not in one central authority or central power, but trust being part of a network which is out there, which could act as a general ledger to do credits and debits, to do financial transactions in a global, public and open way. So, as I say, around 2008 was the time in which Satoshi Nakamoto, who's a mythical character, created a white paper outlining what the Bitcoin protocol was and the underlying storage mechanism of Bitcoin being the blockchain. So Bitcoin being a product and application of the blockchain technology. So, and the idea being that the blockchain technology is then an open and public general ledger. So much like we've seen as a bank statement, but the bank statement being vested with your trust in a central authority and in a bank, this is trust being vested in a digital network of computers which maintain this general ledger between them, which we'll get more into the detail of that shortly. So the intent of the reference implementation and of the white paper was to have a decentralized payment mechanism with trust and security as part of the design. Lifted directly from Wikipedia. But you can also, I guess, kind of understand in the context of a global financial crisis why a character like Satoshi Nakamoto is a virtual character or is not an actual person, because in a world in which, say, people who work in the crypto industry are slightly anxious to the point of potentially being at points paranoid of Big Brother and being monitored, creating a financial network which doesn't rely on a central authority, either a government or a bank, which can be public and open and allow people to trade directly with one another but also anonymously, is not necessarily something that a creator would want to put their name to and be visible as the party that pushes that. I imagine that there's lots of interesting and side cases where people would be worried about their own safety and future if they were the person who created Bitcoin. I'm the person who created the general ledger, which is there as something to take on, tackle and shake the global financial industry. So blockchain being the underlying mechanism which powers Bitcoin. So Bitcoin being a way in which people can trade finances between one another as an open and general ledger. So what is the blockchain? So blockchain being a decentralized and distributed ledger of immutable records. Okay, so we saw in a bank statement that if you want a reversal of a transaction, it doesn't get reversed on your bank statement. Another transaction appears on that statement, which then reverses the earlier state. So the records are immutable. They do not change. If you want to revert or reverse something that's happened in that general ledger, you'd add another record to undo it later on. It's peer-to-peer based, which means that it's not vested with a central authority, and people can join that network, connect to one another, and the trust is actually held across the network. Again, we'll kind of dive slightly more into that shortly. With authentication and verification of records that are on, so how do you know what's there is true? The selfish incentives for participants in the network to act in the right manner. When I say the right manner, selfishly, if they behave in the way that the protocol specifies, there is much for a participant to gain by working according to the rules of the blockchain and Bitcoin specifically network. So we've said that it's distributed. What does that actually mean? How does that differ from a centralized network? So a centralized network, lots and lots of nodes, say like cash machines or something similar to that, all coalesce and go through a central point. So say a central point could be a banking institution's database where your transactions are all held with that banking authority and it's stored centrally, versus something like a decentralized network where we've got lots of small pockets of authority which then come together and coalesce on what is the truth between them, but there's lots of smaller pockets of authority there. This, of course, kind of contrasts quite radically from a distributed ledger and a distributed network where everyone, in theory, on that network is a peer. Everyone has the same amount of control, power, responsibility as every other node on that network. So not flowing and having a central point of trust and authority which determines what is true. The truth is held by the records being consistent amongst every machine on that network. So how does blockchain facilitate having this notion of truth across the network without a central point of authority determining what the truth is? So, and where does the word blockchain come from, I guess, too? So the blockchain itself is quite literally a set of transactions which form a block, which then are chained together based on the hash of the previous previous block of transactions that have happened. So, say I've spent £5. Say I've made 10 purchases. Those 10 purchases could form one block of transactions. At the end of those 10 purchases, say my account balance is X, and say that we use that X to form the next block of transactions that I create. So if I've spent 10 things and I have a balance X at the end of that, we'll take a number from that and then use that to seed the next set of transactions. So the next slide maybe gives it a bit more detail, but it's effectively taking blocks of transactions, generating a number which is unique to that block of transactions at the end, and starting the next block of transactions using that seed number. So it's literally a chain of blocks.
How do you counter uniqueness?
We will get to that too.
Okay.
So, and the double spend, are you thinking in terms of being able to spend money twice, or in terms of the uniqueness of the number that's generated from that block?
Which is effectively the link between the blocks, isn't it? It has to be unique, obviously.
Yeah.
But you have to prove that.
Yeah, so you get the cryptographic hash of the blocks that are in that transaction, plus the address of the creator, plus the timestamp, plus something called a nonce, which is used, which is a one-time only kind of seed to generate the hash. There's an algorithm that lets you make that number unique and then seed the next set of transactions, but they are globally unique too. So we've said that a transaction is represented by a block, and that block is formed of there's then a chain of blocks, but what's within that chain is validated by some blockchain validators. So what validators do is verify that the transactions that are within that set of transactions, that group of transactions, are not invalid. So you can't do things like spend the same amount of money twice. So they won't add those blocks to the chain themselves, but they'll validate that the set of transactions that they're aware of in their link in the chain have not done a double spend. Once that's been validated, the next step is to try and add that block to the chain. And considering that, say, two people might be gathering a set of transactions in parallel, there's then that slight race condition of actually which set of transactions become the next link in the blockchain. But next slide we'll get to that. So up to this point, we've got different creators or different engines which store that set of transactions and validate what they're aware of, and there's then a race to see who can add their set of transactions onto the global blockchain and then add the next link along onto that blockchain. We all okay so far? Yeah?
There's a centralised point in the middle there.
Yeah.
So it's not.
So it is in the centre of the picture, however, not really. So this is replicated many times over. So anyone who's a participant in this network is doing this same process. So say that there's two of us in the network. We're both collecting a set of transactions which we want to be added as the next block of transactions that are then viewable to everyone else on the network. So between the two of us, let's say for example that 10 transactions, 10 drops of water make our bucket full, and we race to see who can have the full bucket first to then add it to the store of buckets. So we'll both race to see who can do that first, which is at this point, and then we'll broadcast out to the network to say, I was first, does anyone else think someone else was first? No? Okay, I get to add mine first then. So this, although it looks like it's a central point, that's actually a broadcast out to every other participant on the network.
But it's a central point of failure though, is it?
In what way?
In that if you don't have that central node, people can't actually try and add their stuff on.
That's not intended to, it's possibly a bad infographic, but it's not intended to be a central node. It's a participant on the network that's just broadcasting to anyone it can reach on the network.
Okay.
So it probably looks as though it's a central node reaching out, but actually you could pivot any of those other nodes to be the central node broadcasting out what they're aware of.
But everybody's using the same node at any one time?
Everyone's trying to connect to as many nodes as possible to broadcast out what they know.
No, I mean in terms of adding a record to the blockchain, they've all got to talk to one particular node, presumably.
No, everyone talks to each other.
Oh, okay.
Everything talks to each other. And so there's validation, which tends to take... so creating a block and validation tends to take about 10 minutes. Then adding something to the network for that to be a valid transaction before the next block can be added to it. Normally on Bitcoin's network takes roughly an hour. And you can get forks, so the network can diverge too. Right. So it can diverge, and at the point at which it tries to converge again, some transactions can be undone or can be appended back onto the end of it if they're valid. So if there's not a double spend within those transactions. So this idea that you mine something, you mine it for 10 minutes, you create valid transactions, and you try and add it to the network, but it's only acknowledged after an hour, where normally about an hour, where you've got over half of the network's consensus that you have the valid block to add.
So there's interval of vulnerability.
Yeah, there's an hour in which you have spent money, but you can't spend it twice, and you're waiting for that acknowledgement back.
And then if somebody else has done a similar thing, the whole consensus will decide which one is correct.
Yeah.
And one will be accepted and one will be rejected, which is
one will be rejected. Most likely it will be rejected from being the next block, and it will try to be the next block after that, as long as the transactions within that block are still valid.
Right.
So
transactions can be effectively revoked.
They can be revoked. It's more likely, especially the larger the network is, that they actually get added on to the end. So actually the bigger danger is that you wait for a very, very long length of time to get an acknowledgement of your transaction.
Right.
So it's unlikely that they get revoked, but it's more likely that quite a long period of time passes between you committing a transaction and that getting acknowledged and added to the chain. Okay. So that's the... In practice, that's the more likely outcome. Right. So, all right. So we've talked about adding blocks into a chain and trying to add into a link and trying to add your link onto that chain to create a blockchain. All right. So slightly more detail of how this happens too. So blocks are linked together as Merkle trees, which are hashes of... already regretting this slide.
You were doing so well.
So the data blocks and the leaf nodes, this is where the data's actually captured. but that's all kept as a hash of the data that's in there. What actually makes blockchain or Bitcoin work in any way, shape or form to be realistically viable as something with any level of performance is the idea that it's stored as a Merkle tree of hashes, so that you can navigate down to those blocks or see what's down one path of hashed blocks in any kind of realistically viable time period. So it effectively takes the hashes of the child blocks which have data in and composes them up all the way up to a root hash, which is ultimately what you get from the blockchain too. There's one genesis block, which was the first block which started the whole blockchain, as authored by Satoshi in 2008, and all the way down you should be able to chain the Bitcoin network all the way back to that first genesis block. The other thing that we get is through validators, the idea that Bitcoin specifically was the first network to have solved the double spend problem in a distributed fashion. So the idea that if I've got £10, I can't spend £10 with you, and spend £10 with you, because those validators, when they come together, will say, actually, that cryptographic hash, that function has been, you've tried to spend that money twice, and that's not valid. So that transaction would get rejected. But it doesn't depend on other nodes being there, because it can do it against the hashes that are there. So, one point that's probably worth making too is that we've talked about the double spend problem as being solved in a novel way by Bitcoin in a distributed fashion, but it's not the only protocol that's out there for doing consensus. So distributed systems have been around for a long, long time, with lots of nodes doing parallel processing, and for a long time we've had various different implementations and algorithms that have tried to do consensual healing. So, sorry, I know it's just flagrant that I use this slide in so many talks that have got nothing to do with blockchain and Bitcoin too. But anyway, so normally if you're trying to do consensus or commit transactions on a central store, say like a database, you'll have things like locks, clocks or shards or voting. They're the typical kind of mechanisms and mutexes and whatnot for doing data consistency. And you get things like clocks, which are used by Google for doing their consistency via things like Spanner. You also have things like shards and voting and different algorithms which do those already for distributed systems, so things like Paxos and Raft. But again, they tend to coalesce when you tend to get consensus based on, say, voting with Paxos or by leader election with Raft, where one person will be, or one node will be the node which determines what the truth is going forwards, as opposed to wholly distributed truth. Alright, so Bitcoin sounds like it's magical, sounds wonderful, decentralized verification, adds blocks to the network, all sounds great, so what's the catch? The catch is that it effectively achieves all of this by burning lots and lots of electricity and lots of power. So the race between nodes to determine which is the one that gets to add a block to the chain is rewarded by, so if you're the person who adds a block to the chain, you are called a miner. In terms of, like working in a gold mine, you're the person who's managed to mine the block and add the block to the chain. There's rewards for being a miner, which you are then rewarded in getting Bitcoin for being the person to keep the network alive and add coins to the chain. And there's a finite number of Bitcoin that are available too. I think it's every 4 or 5 years there's something called a halving, which halves the amount of Bitcoin that you get awarded for adding your link to the chain. But effectively, by being someone who mines the blockchain, you are awarded Bitcoin for your effort. However, that's really being awarded for spending lots and lots of power and electricity trying to be the person to solve a cryptographic algorithm, a cryptographic puzzle, to be the person to add the block to the chain. So to put this into a bit more context, there's only currently 38 countries that definitely consume more electricity than Bitcoin mining. So that kind of graphic, I guess, puts it into perspective that it sounds like it's a magical technology, distributed to a certain extent. Everyone's equal, apart from the truth of it where everyone's not really equal, because if you've got the most mining power, if you've got the biggest computer, you can mine quicker than other people. You stand a much better chance of being the person to add the block to the chain. But yeah, it's always quite it's always quite stark when you see something like that, which shows exactly how much electricity or how much power is being consumed in the generation of Bitcoin. So, as great as it sounds, it doesn't come for free. There is a cost associated to this.
So yellow there was the countries that are doing the most Bitcoin mining, is it? Well, I can't read the key.
All right, so black, definitely more than Bitcoin mining. So total electricity consumption anywhere in black is definitely consuming more electricity than Bitcoin mining costs. Anywhere that's in blue, it's probably a coin toss whether they use more electricity than Bitcoin miners do or not. Anywhere that's yellow is definitely using less electricity as a geographical area than Bitcoin mining does. So,
Okay.
And again, if this was kind of on a global countries list, Bitcoin would be Bitcoin miners in total would be number 39 on that list of electricity consumers. So, anyway, moving on to happier slides. So,
So this is responsible for destroying the planet.
so we will kind of get to that part of it too. But from the tech perspective, it's fascinating, and it does move some level of control and responsibility and power from central authorities for, say, doing things like hand trusting them for your finances. However, so variations of what's there already for Bitcoin and blockchain. The versions of blockchain that we've described thus far are called proof of work versions of blockchain. So proof of work being, for me to be the person to add the next block onto the chain, I have to prove how much work or effort that I've put into doing that, which is normally done by solving a cryptographic puzzle and me having the most number of transactions in my block that I'm trying to add onto the chain. So it's generally the most number of transactions that you've managed to pack into that block is normally the one that wins the race to add the chain onto the blockchain. But the cost of that is an awful lot of power, processing power, to have generated that set of transactions to put in the block. This has been contrasted, or there's active research going on about how this can work with something called proof of stake, which is a different way of being verified as the person to add blocks onto the blockchain. So proof of work is very much how much electricity have I burnt and how much effort have I put into generating that block to put it on the blockchain. Proof of stake tries to change this slightly, and there's lots and lots of different variations of this. Generally, it's can I put funds into, or can I pay for my block being the next block to be added, which is slightly where the idea of a proof of stake comes from. The idea that I will somehow fund my block being the top block to be added to the blockchain. So, but there's active research in how you can move from proof of work to proof of stake, or hybrid systems which might use a bit of both, which is something that a very popular implementation called Ethereum is looking towards in its next release of something called Casper. The Casper protocol tries to blend proof of work and proof of stake into how it validates next blocks on blockchain. Also, another variation here is permission versus public blockchains. So, typical example of a public blockchain is something like Bitcoin, where it's an open network. Anyone can join the Bitcoin network and be an active participant in the Bitcoin network. The alternative to this is the permission network, which is only a restricted number of nodes can join that blockchain network. So say there's 10 active nodes that are all participating to generate items on the blockchain, which obviously has quite a few implications from it. One being that there's far less power used in the race to be the partner to add the next chain onto the block because there's fewer participants in the race. However, if you've got a permissioned blockchain, it's very difficult to see how to vest trust into that permissioned blockchain, because you are then vesting it into a decentralized, or not decentralized, but a much smaller set of authorities. So say if you had a permissioned blockchain which did interbank lending or transactions between banks, you're still vesting your trust in the global banking system, as opposed to it being open and any participant on the network is a node which has an equal chance of validating what's there. So you're still kind of vesting your trust into a central authority or a central set of participants. Uses of blockchain. Okay, so generally any situation where trust, anonymity or disintermediation are seen as good qualities are viable use cases for the blockchain. So case in point, if I wanted to say create a currency in a country where there was hyperinflation, an untrusted government, but I still wanted to have some means of having currency that wasn't subject to that government's authority and subject to that level of inflation, is possibly a interesting or useful case for using, say, Bitcoin as an actual currency there. A kind of popular use of disintermediation at the moment, or one that seems to be gaining popularity, is things like music or publishing rights, or selling publishing rights over the internet. So rather than going through a record company and having margins taken all the way through from the creator to the purchaser, if I can be a creator and sell directly to a purchaser without going through many middlemen and markups, then there's potentially profit to be made there by the disintermediation. So here we're kind of getting into the currency, and I thought I'd put, digital music sales, so digital products. But again, because there's a level of anonymity by using things like public-private key infrastructure to make transactions, this also facilitated things like, say, the Silk Road. Is everyone aware of what the Silk Road is or was when it was operating? So it was an open marketplace where people could buy things which were difficult to impossible to buy otherwise. So people were, in theory, if not necessarily in practice, paying for, say, hitmen or drugs or all kinds of stuff, because they were reasonably anonymous in how they'd make a purchase of a transaction. And then there's the disconnect between how do you make that purchase and actually validate it in the real world when the kind of rubber hits the road. Also used quite a lot at the moment for things like supply chain management and provenance. If people remember the horse meat scandal, so how can I check that the meat that I buy has come from X particular type of creature and not something else which is, say, much cheaper? Well, the idea is that on the supply chain, every stage of that supply chain where that product changes hands is committed to a blockchain as an open public ledger. But again, there's catches with all of this. But it's an open public ledger which can be verified who did what transaction and how it moved from state A to state B or from place A to place B. So blockchain is generally being used in areas where there is little to no trust to try and use the trust in the network. Lots and lots of vendors jumping in on this space. So of course Omnitude who are hosting tonight, which is great. Also we've got the likes of Microsoft and AWS jumping in on this space. JP Morgan, very popular implementations at the moment of blockchain technology are people like Hyperledger, so Hyperledger being an IBM product, and Ethereum, which has been around for a good long while and adds even more functionality onto the general ledger than just acting as a ledger. Alright, so some of the obstacles and challenges that really, I think, are on the horizon for blockchain technology. So the power consumption thing, it's really difficult to see what the end game is that is in a happy place if we're using the 39th most electricity in the world. Something's really got to happen to try and change, whether it's changing the proof of work algorithm to be something different or modifying it in some way to be proof of stake or some hybrid algorithm, but the power consumption is going up all of the time and is something that really is not sustainable. Another massive challenge that certainly a year or so ago had been there for blockchain was the hype factor around blockchain. People jumping onto blockchain and Bitcoin's price going through the roof. No one at that time really understood what they could or should or might be able to use it for, but people were certainly keen to invest in it while they saw that the trend in the price was going up. Which, if you'd have got Bitcoin early enough and sold it early enough, was a great place to be. For people who were on it at a different point in time and got off it or are still in there, it's a slightly less rich place to be. I imagine the price of Bitcoin will go up again, but the hype factor certainly took a lot of the initial, real world implementation or the reality out of what blockchain is, which is it's an interesting and useful technology, but once the hype's out of the way, the technology is still there and it's still growing. So there is actually something there, as much as people like say, oh, Bitcoin, blockchain, it's had its days. No, it's still there and it's still interesting, it's still viable and it's still useful, but it's actually slowly coming back down to earth and the dust is settling. It's just software. So about 4 or 5 years ago, there was the bug in the Ethereum code which allowed, it was something called the DAO hack, if anyone's aware of it, but allowed someone to steal millions from that network. So it was an investment network that was built on Ethereum, but it's just software. It has bugs in it. And if people are able to expose those bugs and manipulate those bugs, then there's rich pickings for someone out there. It's still just software. What's the operational support of the blockchain? Given the fact that many of the transactions are stored encrypted on there, what do you do if someone has lost their private key? How do you monitor, and what's the maturity model of doing releases of blockchain technology too? What's the governance and regulation around it? So again, it's anonymous and it's global. Given that it's append-only records, how does that line up with anything like GDPR? If I'm going to store my personal information on there, how does my right to be forgotten align with an immutable data store which lives everywhere, like blockchain? Human factors. So human factors taps into the fact of, if we're going to use this for, say, supply chain management, you're still vesting a lot of truth and faith into the people who are committing records to the blockchain. So, and the 51% attack is, if I can take over half of the nodes in the network, if I can hack into over half of the nodes in the network, then I can actually control what is a valid transaction and what's not a valid transaction. The problem's a much bigger problem space, but it's still a problem space that is able to be attacked. In terms of human factors, so when we started earlier on, I've got 3 kids, they're not my 3 kids. They're 3 kids off some stock image. I'm not going to show my 3 kids to anyone in the world. But so human factors are, there's a level of trust in people who are committing records, but that trust is vested in me for that image, but that image is incorrect. If I do supply chain management, if I'm putting horse meat into the back of a wagon, you're trusting me to say that it's horse meat or to tell the truth and not just pack any old thing in there. So there's always human factors that come into this. That is a kind of general purpose rights thing. It's an okay image. It's not anyway. So what's the future? Apart from trying to save the world and not boil the ocean, speed and power. So power, we're talking about power consumption. Speed, we're talking about if we're looking at, say, an hour or longer to commit transactions onto that public blockchain or onto those public records, that's really, for Bitcoin, that's really not a viable time duration for it to be viable in the real world. So we need to bring the speed, the time of transactions being confirmed right down, and the power usage right down. Looking at things like IoT and AI, I guess when we don't have a human in the mix and we're looking at a future of lots of autonomous agents being able to do activities and then trying to diagnose where things have gone wrong. So say like on a plane we've got the black box recorder, how would that work with connected devices in the real world? Maybe the blockchain is a great backing store or log store for all of those IoT devices, to actually log their activities onto, and something that can be viewable too. Localized chains and side chains. So this is again shortening the problem space to be, say, country X has this blockchain, and maybe there's, and it acts as a side chain, and maybe there are points at which that coalesces back to a global blockchain, but maybe we have smaller localized chains which then come together. And more research into proofs of, so proof of X. So we've talked about proof of work, we're looking at things around proof of stake, but maybe this actually just reinvigorates more active research and puts more funding into active research around doing distributed systems and validating transactions. So, alright, links and stuff there for some of the stuff that was used in putting this together. And the next thing I'm doing is sometime in March about ethics and technology. Any questions, or maybe John takes the floor and answers any questions after his talk? No? All quiet?
Can I ask an England one?
Yeah, sure.
Today, Russia have been talking about cutting off their internet
Right,
and effectively mirroring the rest of the world so that they're not dependent on it.
right, okay.
Now, if you did that in the middle of blockchain, so everything in Russia thought it had a connection to the rest of the blockchain because the government had set up fake servers.
Yeah.
And it would be an awful mess when it was trying to rejoin the real world again.
Yeah.
How would it, but everybody in Russia would have thought they got valid transactions because it all got authenticated.
Yeah.
How would blockchain cope with that?
They should have valid transactions, because if their transactions are within the network that's in Russia,
No,
and
they
everything
might
else-
not be because they might be to the fake.
what fake?
But if you're spending your Bitcoin within Russia,
Russia, and
then
somebody
you've
else is
basically
spending
got a-
outside of Russia.
Yeah.
When the two things join together again, the spends here and the spends there should be different.
Yeah, but
So
there'd
they
be a
should
lot of transactions within Russia that people thought were going outside Russia that effectively weren't.
I mean, arguably, Bitcoin transactions are the least of your worries. I don't know. I totally agree that if you're spending those Bitcoins within your internal nation state, then
Which is what Russia
arguably,
wants anyway.
yeah, arguably you don't see any difference. And imagine some weird kind of 1984-like future for the UK where we cut ourselves off from the rest of the world. Then potentially transactions within the UK look just as they did before we cut ourselves off. But actually, if we try to do anything internationally, how do we go back from that point? Maybe we're just screwed. In theory,
Yeah.
if that was some kind of weird
He's
dystopian
pretty
future,
excited.
if that was some weird dystopian future that someone crazy would come up with and actually implement, but I'm sure that would never happen.
There would be a lot more things that would be worse than a blockchain not working.
Yeah, blockchain not working.
Yeah.
It's like,
Okay.
yeah,
That's down there.
that's the stubbing your toe of the
Yeah.
Okay,
the
fair
body
enough.
being on the slab. So, but yeah, but no, I've missed that article too. So that sounds interesting. It'd be
They're setting,
Even-
basically, they're trying to behave a bit like China because they don't want to be dependent on any external resources
yeah,
in
it'd
case
be,
of cyber attacks. So they basically throw the big switch. And their bit of the world is the internet, and everybody else is. So they've got fake DNS servers, fake everything that just runs the whole lot.
yeah. I mean, arguably one at least almost social lesson that you kind of learn from. So aside from some of the disadvantages and negatives of the power consumption of blockchain and Bitcoin, some of the kind of positives of the social aspect that you see is that if actually everything's completely open, then there is a degree of trust that has to be in place. So if you have a nation state who then cuts that off, then it's difficult to know where the trust boundary lives, to be honest with
Yeah.
you, let alone on spending money,
Yeah.
just generally. So I'd personally be more anxious of the thought that that kind of nation state could easily track your activities, and you could be spending Bitcoin would be the last thing that I'd panic about in that particular scenario. So, any other questions though? Or just store any of the really difficult ones up for John though. All right, in that case, I'm done, and I think John, you're.
Am I up here? Right.
Yeah, I think so.
Do your own point.
Cheers.